steps, baby. You can rely on my love. Small steps, baby. You can rely on my love.
Okay, everybody, I hate to be the one who interrupts the conversation and the food, but if you could grab a beverage, fill up your plate, wrap up your conversations, and take a seat, please. We will get started in just a few minutes.
Let's take small steps, baby. Can rely on my love. Small steps, baby. You can rely on my love. Let's take small steps, baby. You can rely on my love. Small steps, baby. You can rely on my love. Let's take small steps, baby. You can rely on my love. Small steps, baby. You can rely on my love. Let's take small steps, baby.
Test, test. Test. All right, we're going to get started here. Thank you all for coming today. Welcome to the 2023 South Dakota Chamber of Commerce Economic Summit. We've got an exciting lineup for you today. Fascinated to hear what Dr. Santos, Dr. Shequin have to say, and then a great panel on why companies choose South Dakota. We couldn't do this without our sponsors, and we also can't do this without the staff. So, Mary Ann, Boyd, I'm not sure where you're at, but I just want to say a quick thank you to you, and also to David Owen, and to the rest of the steering committee that helps put this on. To our sponsors, Avera Health, First Premier Bank Card, Mid-American Energy, Northwestern Energy, Sanford Health, Augustana University, First Bank and Trust, First Dakota, Otter Tail Power, SDN Communications, South Dakota State University, Valley Queen Cheese, Excel Energy, and the Chamber. A big thank you to the sponsors. Please help me in welcoming them. Thanks. And I know you didn't come here to hear me, but a lot's changed in the last year. I was just doing a little research this morning. The Consumer Price Index has gone from about 8.7 to about 3.7. Fed funds rate's gone from about 2.5% to about 5.5%. There's a lot of moving dynamics and a lot of change, and we're going to hear a little bit more about that here coming up. And I will now introduce Jody Schwan, who really probably needs no introduction, the founder of Sioux Falls Business and the lady who knows everything that's going on in this city. Please welcome Jody Schwan. Thanks, Jody.
Program And I needed to confirm that because I think there's probably going to be some news coming out of the event today that I may need to go back and revisit and then report. So as Reggie said, I'm Jody Schwan. I'm your moderator for today. Thank you to the South Dakota Chamber for inviting me back once again to do this program with you this year. They do a phenomenal job coordinating everything. They always have such timely information for us, and I know that's what keeps you all coming back as well. So I think you're in for a really informative and enlightening next couple of hours. We are going to kick things off today, though, a bit different. For those who have been here in the past, you probably remember that Joe Santos always delivers a timely look at the economy. He's going to do that again today, but in a slightly different format. So just as a reminder, Joe Santos directs the Ness School of Management and Economics at South Dakota State University, where he also leads the Dykhouse program in money, banking, and regulation. Now this year, he is going to be addressing the economy in a conversation with David Chiquin. David Chiquin, of course, led South Dakota State University as its 19th president for nearly a decade before retiring in 2017. So they are going to have a conversation, and then you are also going to have an opportunity to ask Joe some questions. So be thinking of those. Please help me welcome Joe and David.
Thanks, Jody.
Yep.
Thank you, Jody. And thanks to each and every one of you for joining us today. This is a unique opportunity for me to ask my colleagues some really in-depth questions, and it's a unique opportunity for you during the second half of the show to play Let's Trump Joe. So think carefully about those questions. And I want to thank Joe for being with us now for the 6th year.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, it just seems like yesterday. Joe's been busy. As Jody has stated, he started out providing the background for the seminar when he was a professor of macroeconomics and a Dykhouse scholar. But now for almost 15 months, he's taken on the mantle of being the director of the Ness School for Management and Economics. And Joe, you had an event last week. Tell us a little about that.
We did have an event last week, so thank you. And hello, everyone, and thank you for having me here today. And I just want to say this is, actually, I give him a lot of grief, but this is a real honor because when David was president of SDSU, I learned from him every day, and he is a mentor. For me, and so this means the world to me. But on Friday, the Ness School of Management and Economics hosted a ribbon-cutting event to recognize the beginning of a partnership with Startup Sioux Falls down on Phillips Avenue. And this partnership is going to make for an opportunity for the Ness School to engage in what we think of as sort of extension, broadly defined outreach, bringing panel discussions and speakers and so forth, discussions much like this one, downtown to Sioux Falls. And so this is, I like to think of it as an instrument of Ness School outreach. And we started it last Friday, not just with the ribbon cutting, but an event that focused on entrepreneurship and innovation and risk-taking and so forth. And we're going to continue this programming now going forward. So look for events that are playfully labeled Ness School Downtown Outpost is what we think of it as, because we'll be having events there now going forward. So thanks for that opportunity for a plug. I appreciate that.
Well, every time is an opportunity, and thank you for being with us today, but you had a little bit of stuff you did yesterday, too. Joe, as you might know, recall, does Monday Macro on the first Monday of each month. So yesterday was the 2nd of October and the first Monday. So if you haven't gotten unschooled and read the blog, I encourage you to do so. So Joe, what topic did you cover yesterday?
Yeah, so yesterday we were talking a bit about, this is with Lori Walsh, who hosts In the Moment, of course, and she just allows me a few minutes on the program. She's gracious enough to include us. But we were talking about, I titled it Productive Thinking, and this was looking at labor productivity and the supply side of the economy, not just in and of itself, though I think that's interesting, and we can talk about that if you wish, but also how that might inform our thinking about the path of interest rates and what I'm arguing this afternoon, a return to normal. And let me just maybe jump into that a little bit. Give away the punchline early. I think it may be useful for all of us to think about what we're heading into next is maybe, I hope, something more normal than what we have experienced, and you think I'm going to say during the pandemic, and I'm not. I'm going to say since about 2008. I think the environment that we have been operating in since about 2008 has not been normal from the perspective of interest rates, from the perspective of market liquidity, from the perspective, if I may, of the mispricing of risk, which I don't know that the consequences of that have been fully recognized yet. But when risk doesn't cost anything, you tend to take on a lot of it. And so I think that what we're starting to see now, maybe, just maybe, is going back to a world where interest rates actually reflect the basic human desire to have now versus later. Think about that for a minute. It seems as if we've simply suspended our desire for present consumption over future and giving things away at zero interest rates. That's not normal. A Federal Reserve that has played a role in debt markets and sovereign debt markets specifically, it has never played such a role before. That was not normal. That unwinding, again, will be a return to normalcy. And also a government that has been able to borrow rather significantly in ways that, again, I don't think reflect fully the tensions in credit markets that you would expect under normal circumstances where lenders would prefer not to be separated from their money. So I think when I turn on CNBC in the morning, and there's no offense to CNBC, but I hear someone say, well, the Fed's up to 5.25 to 5.5. Maybe there's one more in there, and then I think we'll start to see it come back down by the summer. That's the thinking I'm suggesting we stop doing. I don't think this notion of what I call a sort of reversion to the mean, a mean that was established between 2008 and a little bit post-pandemic, is correct, if I may. I don't think we revert back to the sort of dysfunction, the monetary and to some extent fiscal dysfunction. I don't mean that in any sort of political criticism. I just mean, again, the mispricing of risk and so forth. I don't think we return to that if we can avoid it. So that's a lot, sorry. I won't talk that much
really
every
long
time you
answer.
stop talking. I'm sorry.
So before I ask Joe the next question, so that you can get ready to listen, I would like to see how well we can have an audience participation experience. Because in about 15 minutes, you're going to have to ask the tough question. So I would like all of those with us today who are card-carrying economists or aspirational economists to raise your hand. Come on. Michael, put your hand up. Anybody else? Only, I see 1, 2, 3, 4. Jared, thank you. Okay. Second question. Those of you who are accountants, studied accounting in school, are CPAs, migrated into CFO positions, raise your hand. Come on. There's got to be some people out there that claim accountancy. Okay, so all of those who didn't raise your hands, I hope you see those people who did. Because there's this theory that the reason people become economists is because they didn't have the personality to be an accountant, even though they were good with numbers. So you can test that theory as you look at those who raised their hand as an economist and those who raised their hand as an accountant. So. Joe, you talked a little bit about, in the promo materials, now something weird. And I think you gave us a context of that in your last set of comments. Why don't you pick up there and look at prices and what's going on within the Federal Reserve efforts to achieve low or stable inflation, whether it's a success? What is low and stable inflation as we think about it? And then As the monetary policy approaches the near norm, what do you expect those interest rates to be?
Sure. Okay. In fairness, that's a lot. So if I talk
Okay,
for more than a minute, you got to.
Right.
So,
You're on your own.
no grief. First of all, it's time for something weird. I was just referring to us, by the way. But I was also thinking about just, again, how weird things have been until now. And so I anticipated a question or two, and I brought along a chart or two. So can we queue up? I think it'll be the first one that comes up. If we can flip to it. That's it. So what you're looking at here in blue, the thing that looks like Devil's Tower, in blue, that's the growth in the money supply during the pandemic, right? So this goes from 2019 forward, and that, again, Devil's Tower looking thing is the growth in the money supply. You read the left scale for that, so go up to the very high peak, let's say, so we're all looking at the same thing. Go up to the very high peak, turn left, and you'll hit a number like 26% year-over-year growth. So that's enormous, right? That's unprecedentedly large. That's weird. What you also notice then is that the growth in the money supply slows, and then it's maybe hard to see that, but there is a grid line there that lines up with 0, which tells you that that blue line has now dipped below that grid line that lines up with 0, and so the growth in the money supply is actually negative. So this process is sort of in pullback. What's also interesting about this, and very textbook-like, is that then you see the red line. And the red line follows the blue line. So first you get the blue peak, and then you get the red peak. And the red peak, of course, is the inflation rate. And this is according to the Federal Reserve's preferred measure, the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index, minus food and energy. As long as you don't drive and eat, this is relevant, right? So that red one, if you notice, it takes about 12 to 18 months before the red line goes up in the way the blue line went up. Two different scales, but you get the general features of this pattern. So that is textbook. But then there's something I think is kind of interesting and, again, weird, and that is the red line. It's coming down, there's no question. But if you notice, the red line is sort of plateauing. The last data point there reads 4%, right? But the blue has dipped down into this negative range, right? So the money growth has slowed dramatically, but the inflation rate is still sort of persistently or annoyingly high, right? So what's going on there? Right? There is another variable at play. And if we flip this, we'll get to something really esoteric. To the next slide, you'll see what's sort of making up the difference between red and blue, I think. So high inflation, just think, again, I'm just generalizing so we remember things together, a relatively high number. We didn't like where that red line ended in that last picture. It was 4%. Money growth, negative. So what could possibly be stimulating inflation if the money growth is falling, because we know money is the source of all inflation? Well, this is, next picture, is you want to think about this as how would you use a number in a sentence. Let's all go to the peak, go up, turn left to the very high peak, and you get a number like 0.85. How do you use 0.85 in a sentence? The amount of money in circulation right now, numbers, registers of value that is roughly 85% of GDP. That is bizarre. So in other words, they're two different concepts. I'm just scaling them. But the amount of money, as I tell my students, the amount of the stuff that you go to Jimmy John's with and buy lunch, that's what we mean by money here. This is M2 money, is roughly, was 85, 87, almost 90% of GDP. So that reflects a preference. This is not right, it's not wrong. It's much like saying I like chocolate ice cream. This is I like holding large money balances relative to the purchase I need to make. This would be like a household, I don't know, buying $150,000 worth of stuff and over the course of the year actually owning as a percentage of its wealth $150,000. Nobody does that, right? We use smaller balances and we exchange them over and over again typically. So this has been a very high or large preference for money holding, and as you notice, you see a dip down. So again, in plain English now, the money growth has fallen, but so too has our preference to hold on to it. We're still hoarding it, historically speaking, but we're not hoarding it in the way we were at the peak of the pandemic. It's down to a whoppingly low 77%, right? But it's falling. So money growth falls in supply, but if also our preference to hold money is falling, then there's less of it, but I don't want it. That's still an inflationary force. Right? So the Fed is contending, and this gets the interest rate question, they're contending with the money supply, which they can reduce the supply of, but then they're contending with a preference, like I like chocolate versus I like strawberry, and this is I like large money balances relative to my income. And if we don't like large money balances relative to our income, think green line is starting to fall, they have to deal with that as well. 'Cause that's it, right? If we all, shut the door and everybody chase after everyone else and say, please take my dollar, think of what happens to the value of the dollar. You have no fewer dollars. You're not going to succeed at this. The doors are shut. You're going to just hand it to each other, but it's going to fall in value, right? So when that desire to hold large money balances starts to decline, and again, you see how far down normal is, that is itself an inflationary force. So if I'm the central bank and I'm an old school monetarist, as you can tell I am, I'm thinking we need to be very diligent about this, very aggressive about this monetary tightening, perhaps more so than the folks who are saying we go back to something lower in 6 months are thinking. That's just one way to think about it. We can go more into these rates, but that's one.
So how did the preferences of those who hold the money get set so that they desired more cash, more M?
Right.
And now it's tapering off. They want to get rid of it. They don't want to hold so much. So regardless of what other people try to do to control aggregate demand, they're out there spending a little money.
That's right, and that's a great point. That green line falling is aggregate demand increasing, right, for a reason of preference. And so that's right. And so if you're a central bank, and by the way, all you have is a central bank, for as powerful we make this institution out to be, they do not have policy instruments, think dials and levers, that affect aggregate supply. It's always aggregate demand. So all they can do is, as we like to say rather crudely, destroy demand or suppress demand or stimulate demand. That's all they can do. But we can do those things too. Our preference for smaller money balances will itself fuel demand. So they've got to work against that. And, the idea that we don't want to hold money balances to the tune of 90% of GDP is actually sort of good news. It's an absence of dysfunction, but it stimulates aggregate demand.
So that leads me to a question about the velocity, which has historically been part of this equation. So has that tapered down as these money balances have held?
That's right. So if you divide take 1 over this, you get velocity. In fact, to create this, I took 1 over velocity. Exactly. So you're looking at the inverse of velocity. So another way to think about this is the V, the velocity term, is rising. Green line's falling, velocity's rising. Now, again, to your point, it's comically low. That is, the amount of times money changes hands to buy GDP. It's been roughly 1 to 1. I was a million years ago when I studied with monetarists, it was 2.5 or 3. I mean, it's not, again, this idea of normalcy or weirdness or whatever. It's odd from my perspective anyway to see so much money. Again, I'm talking about the stuff you go to Jimmy John's with and buy lunch. So much money relative to the size of the economy. It's really inefficient, right? You don't want to hold so much of your wealth in the form of a simple medium of exchange.
It'd be better off if we put it to work.
Right,
So
right.
as that happens,
it goes down. Now, of course, just like it never leaves the room,
right,
it chases after things, and those things are stuff and then prices of stuff. And so this is where the supply side comes in. If there's no more stuff, it chases after this, and the price of it goes up.
inflationary.
If we're productive and innovative and we have interesting ingredients and innovative recipes and we come up with more of this, then it turns into more stuff, and that's great. So either, we say P or Y can go up when we all start chasing each other saying, please take my dollar. But there are reasons why I would reason right now the supply side of the economy, things like underwhelming productivity and so on, I don't think are going to come save the day with more stuff. And so it's probably a bidding war.
Push demand down.
Right. You got to push demand down, it seems to me. Yeah.
So
I get no Christmas cards in case you wonder, because I put nobody in a good mood. Yeah.
Because essentially, as you've written before, GDP per capita is a measure of how well off we are.
Right.
So if you push that down for that period of time, in the aggregate sense, we are less well off than we used to be.
That's right.
So we get grumpy, I suppose.
Yeah. Which is what happens when you hang out with economists.
Yeah.
Right.
So talk a little bit about the Silicon Valley Bank matter that created a bit of a liquidity issue and classic, 1930 style
bank run
on the bank. and whether or not you were surprised by that.
I was surprised by that, and then I sort of suggested maybe we go there, not so much to rehash the story, though we could with Q&A if you want, but more so, again, what does it imply about interest rates in the new normal? So, you know, that was the situation, as lenders in the room know. You, as we say, you borrow short and you lend long, right? The liability side of your balance sheet has a maturity of, you know, measured in days or months, and the asset side has a maturity measured in years. So when interest rates rise, your debt, if you will, rolls over rather quickly. Depositors have options and they can go elsewhere for higher rates, but your folks who are locked in at 10 and 15 years just look at you and laugh, right, in relief that they don't. They got a lower rate. So that's the tension that was imposed on Silicon Valley Bank, and there were mismanagement issues around that interest rate risk. But it did, mismanagement aside, I think, reflect the challenge a central bank has, and this is pure speculation, but what other place to do it, right? That as a central banker, I know I would be thinking, I'm going to raise the federal funds rate. Think of that as the cost of inventory, right? I'm going to raise the cost of inventory by 525 basis points in 18 months. That may impose some interest rate risk challenges on the, 4,600 commercial banks in the country that are the primary source of lending for most, you know, less well-established firms whose names we can't rattle off, like GM and McDonald's. And so maybe I have to go a bit slowly. So all I'm suggesting, this is absolute speculation, but if I'm the central bank, two things could be simultaneously true. I could agree with Joe's high interest rates for longer argument, and I could be doing it gradually. Because to do it very aggressively would impose enormous interest rate risks on these banks. And my guess is living through SVB only reinforced the nightmare, you know, for Jay Powell and the team. Again, you can write it off as mismanagement, but it still happened. And mechanically it happened because of borrowing short and lending long. So again, I have no idea to confirm that, but it's certainly, I don't think anyone would look at SVB and say, great, raise them faster, right? That wouldn't be the knee-jerk response to that.
So you speculate it influenced their decisions as they went forward from...
Yeah, I wonder if that's an explanation. Again, this is really wild speculation, but for folks who say, oh, come on, if they knew the rates had to go up faster and sooner and all that, they would have done it. And I'm just suggesting that there was evidence during the last, say, 18 months that maybe a more gradual approach would be more prudent. And not for the sort of political reasons that sometimes come up. I don't think that really has haunted them this time around. It does. They're not impervious to it, but it didn't this time. It was more the mechanical process of I times assets minus I times debt, you know, and the net interest margin being so heavily suppressed because of the rise in rates.
So you give the financial institutions longer time to adjust.
To adjust, to breathe, but it's going, right, but we know where it has to go.
Has to happen. Yep. So speaking of that, you suggested I ask you what is the reason for higher long-term rates?
Yeah.
And what does higher really mean? How do you get to the higher from where we where we were when it was lower,
Right.
and where we are now, and then what is the higher, and what are the components?
Yeah. So if we focus on, let's say, focus on a 10-year AAA rated debt instrument. So the answer to the question, why is that rate rising, is somewhat unsatisfying, because the answer becomes, whoops, oh, that's very sweet. Thank you.
More water than we
incredibly
ever thought
gracious.
we needed.
So the answer to the question, why is the 10-year interest rate 5%? And the answer is, the traditional answer goes by something we call an expectations theory. That is to say, well, 5% is very simple, is arithmetically the average of all of the one-year interest rates on the way to 10 years. That's the simple story. So then that's not very satisfying, because the answer to the question, why is the interest rate so high, is because we think the interest rates are going to be high, right? But that's one part, is that short-term interest rates on the way to 10 years from now are rising. And since the 10-year rate's the average of the 10 short rates, the 10 years higher. Okay, so that just moves the question to, why do we think short-term interest rates are going to rise. All right, so any interest rate, by the way, we're talking about a nominal interest rate. So when I say suppose the 10-year rate is 5%, I mean that is literally the amount of money you get back on principal that you lent. So I lent you $100, I got back $5 and my $100. It's nominal. That is to say, we do not know if I can buy 5% more stuff. It just, maybe it's 5% more expensive now, right? It's just a nominal rate. Okay, so every nominal rate then we can dissect into what? A real rate, which is truly capturing the purchasing power. I gave you $100 and I could have bought this with $100. The real rate's 2%. How do you use it in a sentence? You're going to give me back something that allows me to buy this plus 2% of this. More stuff. So there's a real rate embedded in every interest rate, and there's expected inflation. So back to the question. Why does the market think rates are going to rise? Because the market must be thinking either the real interest rate, as I tell my students, don't think money, think coconuts. The amount of coconuts I want back for the amount of coconuts I gave you, stuff for stuff. The real interest rate's going up, or the expected inflation rate's going up. I don't think the expected inflation rate's driving it. I think people recognize that the Fed is, I would argue, rightly credible in fighting inflation, and this is going to sort of attenuate, and it'll be at 2% or something. I don't think that's what they're thinking is going to be novel about every one of the 10 years. It's the real rate. So next slide, if we could. This is a really interesting number. So what is this thing? I don't know. Everybody look at the last data point, so we're all looking at the same thing. Very last data point on the right. Go up, turn left, you get a number like 1.1. All right, what's 1.1? This is a measure of an equilibrium long run, well, forgive me, equilibrium 1-year interest rate over the long term, right? So this is the New York Fed's work with some folks there who have tried to come up with this, and how to use 1.12 in a sentence. It's that when we are at our Goldilocks economy and everything is right with the world, that would be the percentage of coconuts I want back for the amount of coconuts I gave you. That's the real rate. And what you notice is during the financial crisis and ever since, this real rate estimate, it may be wrong, but I'll come back to that in a second, dropped dramatically, bizarrely, if you consider the fact that most of us prefer present over future consumption. Why were we charging so little to surrender our money? But this measure is rising, and I think rightly so. That is the sense that the Fed has. It's a counterfactual. We can't know for sure, but the sense is when this economy is at Goldilocks, output is right where its potential is, inflation is right at the target, the real rate then that prevails is probably getting close to 2. So that's 2. The inflation rate, if the Fed is credible, 2. That's 4. So every year there's 4. Then when you want to separate someone from their money for 10 years, you have to compensate them. That's a term premium. I don't know what it is. 1, 2, I don't know, just for argument. Let's say it's 1. So now we got 2 plus 2 plus 1. And then there's that wonderful feeling when you're separated from your money that you may never see it again. That's a default risk premium. I don't know what that is. Let's call it 1. So now, on something other than sovereign debt, though the fiscal crises we're living through, maybe even sovereign debt will have default risk, but to say other than sovereign debt, we got, what did I say, 2 plus 2 plus 1 plus 1, we got 6, right? And that's based on, again, an R star that is rising. I started that with that too. Now back to that number. What is this number? Well, the theory behind this is that what it reflects in equilibrium are 2 fundamental forces, and if you think of them, you probably get close to 2%. One is the idea that I prefer present to future. This has been true since the dawn of civilization. If I give you 100 coconuts, you took them from me, I want my 100 back, and I want more coconuts, right? I want some return in real terms because I don't like to surrender present consumption. So that's in that number. There's some amount that I want to be rewarded for surrendering consumption, and that's a big deal. And then the return on capital, productivity growth. So that's been numbering like 1. So how much do you want back in a year if you gave someone something you would have preferred to consume? Maybe 1%. And what's a good return on capital? Well, the productivity rate right now is coming up to about 1. That's 2. So under normal circumstances, you'd expect 2. That's where that's sort of coming from. Again, it's all very counterfactual, but as I like to ask folks when they start giving me that doubting look like, you don't know that's right. Do you really think it's lower? Do you really think it's lower than it's been? Do you really think we have suddenly all changed our human nature in the last couple of years, like 7 compared to a few, million and say, no, actually take it from me. I want you to take it from me. That's what a very low real rate would suggest, and I don't think that has changed about human behavior. So I think it's going to be higher. So that's it. 2 + 2 + 1 + 1 is 6. That seems more normal to me.
So that's the answer to the question.
I think it's 6. I mean, I don't know if it's 6, but I think it's probably something like 6 because I think
6.
normal.
I got
right,
6. Did
right.
you get 6?
Right. Now, there's since we're clearly all having some fun with this, there's one caveat, and that is, like I said, it has to do with that time preference. It also has to do with return on capital. If you reason that we go back to something that we were calling secular stagnation, where the return on capital wasn't very high, maybe R-star's a little lower. This idea is not new to the financial crisis. We do have periods of secular stagnation. Incidentally, it's a term coined by Alvin Hansen, who I know as the president of the American Economic Association in the 1950s, but you may know as a resident of Viborg, South Dakota, because that's where Alan Hansen's from. But he coined secular stagnation in the 50s. It's something that does at times happen. Point is, if that were to happen, a lower R-star would be more reasonable, but again, not 0.
So if you look long-term at R-star, is your 1 plus sort of in the game?
I think 1+ is still too low, right? I think 2, when no one would do the work of John Williams, who's now the president of New York Fed, by the way, same guy, of John Williams and his co-authors to do this, most folks used to just say 2.
Yeah, just
that was
say
sort
2.
of the common.
Okay.
But it's probably not 30, and it's not 25 basis points. It's probably, again, if you just think of what fundamentally drives it, you get to something
2.
around 2. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like a sort of a cheap shot, but actually it seems pretty reasonable when you think of the sources.
2 + 2 + 1 + 1, 6.
6, and
Okay.
if you and maybe worse if sovereign debt gets downgraded. That's a thing.
So as you look then at that future, this notion that the Fed's going to, if we enter a period of slow growth, not even a recession, is going to start to relax their monetary policy, become more accommodating. How do you put those two things together?
And that's a really good question. I think that's why I brought up that nuance. I know that was a little deep in the weeds, but again, because the fundamental real rate is driven by productivity. If we are, as you said, not so much in recession, we're not talking about business cyclicality, we're talking about potential output just doesn't grow as much.
Right.
Then you would expect a lower fundamental interest rate. Again, just think of this in terms of competition. If no one can get a very good return on capital because of low productivity and returns to capital and so on, then a lower interest rate could prevail, right? Competition would make it so. Who would pay any more if the returns on capital were low? So that's a good point. This sort of stagnation is not a recession. It's just a fundamental feature of the potential of the economy to produce at a slower rate than otherwise. And that started, there are folks who've done a lot of work on this that say, the timing with the Great Recession actually is probably coincidental. 05, 06, something like that, this slowdown in productivity. And maybe that piece is a normal return to. It doesn't seem like that was caused by the financial crisis.
So put some numbers to that. So where was labor productivity during a period of time, either when we were growing well, and then what happened, and then more recently, where are we relative to those historical
really good
pieces?
question. Yeah.
And then more importantly, how do we influence
Yeah.
labor productivity? What do we do if we
do?
don't like what we're seeing?
Yeah. So where we are now, if we were to use 2008 to right up until the second quarter of 2023, we have, so this is the way I did it. I took quarterly growth and productivity. It's very noisy, but then I averaged it over a year. And we have a productivity average quarterly annualized rate. I do the same thing for every one of these eras in monetary history, in U.S. monetary history. We are lower than the productivity slowdown of 72 to 95. Not by much, but we look like that. We look like the period that we all have in our macro textbooks as the slow productivity period. It's roughly 72 to 95.
So what's the number?
It's about 1.4, and I think if you do this, when I did the same thing in an Excel spreadsheet, I get like 1.5 for that era, and I get like 1.4 for hours. So if you think about this in terms of total growth, that's like output divided by bodies, and then you get the growth in the bodies. So if you're dealing with like 1.4 and you get a population growth, however they get here, of 1, the whole GDP growth is like 2.5. That's it.
Which is within the parameters.
Within the parameters. It's nothing great, but great would have looked more like 3.
Right.
Great would have looked more like roaring 60s into the early 70s. It would look more like 3.
So how do we influence that?
So as I always like to tell my students, it's about ingredients, capital, essentially, broadly defined, machinery, tools, equipment, software, whatever, and then the recipes, the way we bring those ingredients together. Right? We don't have new ingredients now relative to 400 years ago. All the ingredients are the same, but we figured out new and innovative ways of bringing them together. So it's either the ingredients or the recipes. The central bank, I won't take it back there for long, but the central bank, just to put a point on this, has no dial or lever that says ingredient or recipe. So it isn't going to come from them because that's all aggregate demand management. It comes from the supply side, and it's messier. It comes from policies that I like to think of as that incentivize behavior that yields both private and public returns. That's really what we need, right? Behavior that incentivizes only private returns is not bad, but the stuff that also incentivizes public returns tend to raise the greater good. So this is not a plug for public ed, but public education is a good example of that, right? Lots of folks in this room who didn't, walk that May in graduation benefit from the fact that those folks walked, right? So that's that's a non-market outcome, a positive externality that we get with public education as an example. Child care is another example of something that would yield public goods, right? Because everybody benefits when those folks come to the labor force. So those sorts of activities, private returns and public returns, I think are what we need to incentivize. And it seems to me, you asked, so I'll say, I think the fundamental resource here is knowledge and the creation of that knowledge. So knowledge and learning, if you will, I think is the fundamental input to all of this. And maybe AI and other things can complement that process, but that's what it is. It's not changing interest rates.
Contributes to technology advancement
Right.
and also the skill level of the human element.
That's right.
Human capital accelerates.
Right.
So that's
And
how
it's-
you can influence.
That's
that.
how you influence it. And, policies that are sensible that allow free enterprise to flourish in ways, again, that yield not just private returns. Theft yields private returns, but private returns. And, that's not the only thing that does, but I'm just making a hard point that you also want the public returns, right?
Good. Okay, we have time now for your involvement in the Let's Stump Joe part of our program.
You could stump him, too.
I'm easier to stump than he is.
No, it's not true.
So who's got a question? Or you can actually make a counterpoint if you wish.
Yeah.
And there's microphones there and there. Or if you have an outside voice, just use it. I'm going to call on Michael Bender because he thinks about questions all the time, and he's hesitant to ask them.
I knew it. I knew it.
Good afternoon. Thanks for being here, both of you. Joe, it was probably 4 years ago, you educated this group on the virtues of the Phillips curve.
Yep.
And you told us that that was a very reliable economic analysis to better understand both inflation and employment or unemployment. Are you still as confident that the Phillips curve works? And given demographic changes in the labor force, maybe that could be a reason why you aren't. But I'm just curious whether or not, am I just impatient, or is that really still a good analysis for future decision making?
Yeah, did I really say all that about the Phillips curve? never thought I was that much of a fan of it, but okay. So the Phillips curve is this trade-off, as we like to think, between unemployment and, as A.W. Phillips proposed it in the 1950s for the British economy, wage inflation. So to be fair to him, he was not plotting inflation, he was plotting wage pressure, and said that there was a negative relationship between unemployment, think unemployment goes down, and wage pressures rise. We sort of took that in the 60s, in the heyday of aggregate demand management, and said, this is a policy menu, just looking at us, all we have to do is figure out what unemployment rate we want, go up, turn left, look at the inflation rate, produce that inflation, and we'll produce the unemployment. And produce, obviously, a low unemployment was the goal. So Monetarists cannot simultaneously say everything I said and then say good things about the Phillips curve. But I do think that if nothing else, I mean, the relationship or the trade-off, that curve has a slope. And I know this seems a bit like an out, but it's flat. I will say that. It is flat. And that is to say what? That the sensitivity of inflation to labor market forces seem to have failed for a while. And post-COVID, I don't know how you interpret a Phillips curve in the way that Phillips or successors shortly thereafter would interpret it, because that's a really weird labor market disruption. But to your point, it was failing us prior to COVID because the labor market continued to tighten, unemployment continued to decline, and the inflation never appeared. But to your point, to your question, I think it is something that is embedded in the minds, in part because it's embedded in the textbooks of macroeconomic policymakers, that as they see the unemployment rate go low, they surmise that there's got to be inflation, in part because if you look at GDP and you think of it as income, the vast majority of it, 70-something% of it, is wage income. So, if all these 162 million of them get together and argue for higher wages, that pressure will have inflationary effects. But I don't know that, in all honesty, I mean, I don't doubt I said that, but I actually don't go there as quickly as I go to R-star and stuff like that. I tend to think of it more as a fundamental cost of credit that we seem to be violating when interest rates are very low, and it's then that I expect inflationary forces, more so than low unemployment rates. So rather than low unemployment rates lead me to think we got inflation coming, if that's a Phillips curve mindset, I tend to think more like interest rates are lower than what I think would prevail if 2 + 2 + 1 is 1 is 6, and that's inflationary. But no, I don't think a policymaker right now does very well to just look at the inflation rate and from that alone keep interest rates high, because the implication is with low unemployment comes high inflation. I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't think that's the right approach.
Somebody else? A thought? Doesn't have to be a question. Here we go.
Joe, could you speculate for us as to the costs of inflation as we see it right now, some of which, of course, is increased wages for American citizens, versus the cost of not having injected that kind of money into the economy?
Fair question. Yep, so is this a necessary evil, maybe? I don't want to presuppose the premise of your question, but was this a necessary evil? I think to an extent it was. Now, I won't speculate. I'll do something even less respectable. I'll just look back and have 20/20 vision, right? I think it's safe to say that when output gaps, just think where you want to be versus where you actually are, were only about as large, the difference, of maybe $600 billion when, say, the third fiscal stimulus was released into an economy numbering, what was it, 1.9 trillion? So 3 times the gap. That is an excessive amount of fiscal stimulus that I don't think was warranted in terms of lowering unemployment rate or what have you. But having said that, I reason that the stimulus, both at the monetary and the fiscal level, had a place, as I like to say, and I don't know what the answer is to this, but poison's in the dose. I don't always know what the dose is, but poison's in the dose. And I don't think it was, in principle, necessarily poisonous to create emergency lending facilities and even grow the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, or on the fiscal side to have paycheck protection programs that tried to keep folks attached to their jobs and so on. There were places for all those things, but it is pretty clear now, not necessarily to me then, but me now, with hindsight, that particularly the last fiscal tranche, and I don't care who initiated it, this is an apolitical statement, it's just arithmetic. It was about 1.9 trillion, and the gap we were trying to fill was 600 billion. That seems to me an environment that would stimulate aggregate demand in a way that would create inflation, and in a way that would not really benefit anyone to justify the additional inflation. But prior to that, I think some of the blunt instruments were understandably blunt and probably very reasonable. The lowering of interest rates, the increasing the Fed's balance sheet, the increasing the stimulus. But again, poison's in the dose, and there was too much of a dose, and it's clear.
We have time for a couple more, if they're out there. Here comes Jared,
Oh boy.
a card-carrying economist.
Yeah.
We know
This is gonna be
there was
good.
one
Good-
out there.
good for him, not for me.
He and only two others raised their hand, you know, when we asked how many people.
Well, I'm going to give you another easy one because I just want some speculation. I was really sort of intrigued in maybe seeing patterns when patterns don't exist. It's kind of asking for some speculation, but the sort of movements in the opposite directions of kind of R-star and the long-term productivity and the desire for money balances. And I'm just kind of curious if you think there's a tie between some of these things, causal, or if it's just correlation. Really curious about what the hell happened between 2010 and 2018, because that seemed to be this period where things really started moving in unexpected directions.
Yeah.
So, there you go.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the other bit with R-star is, of course, when we think about it very simply as our time preference being reflected in some base interest rate, the percent of coconuts I want back, and productivity rates, there's also a risk element. That's a sort of in a world of certainty. That's a model where we have certainty, a sort of standard macro model with certainty. Without it, you have risk, and with risk, we have higher rates. What I'm getting at is, to the extent that risk lived inside of R-star, when the balance sheet of the central bank grew from 800 billion to an order of magnitude larger to 8 trillion, I think that leads to a mispricing of risk. And by mispricing, I don't think it was too expensive, of course. I think it was too cheap. Maybe that's an explanation for, you can see there, you don't have to look at the axis. You can just tell where 2008 is, and R-star collapses. It's not so much that we became risk-loving and we're willing to take lower rates because we love the risk we were exposing it to, or we were exposing our wealth to. I think it might have been that risk was sort of purged from the system, right? Because again, you have a bank, a central bank, that goes from a balance sheet of 800 billion to a balance sheet, I'm rounding, but 8 trillion. So that's an enormous amount of rate or price suppression. And so perhaps that then also brings down R-star to the extent that risk is no longer a part of the game.
calculation.
Yeah, and just, David asked me, was I surprised by SVB? This is a bit cynical, but I was, to the extent that I didn't think anybody really still thought they could lose their deposits, because the moral hazard
Right.
was so bad and the sense of risk in the market was so distorted. I was actually pleasantly surprised that people still ran on banks, in the sense that there was still some semblance of risk in the market, because I thought it had all been purged out. So I don't know if that's good enough, but yeah.
I want to ask you to please join me in thanking Joe for
thank
providing
you.
this insight as we move on to our panel.
Thank you, sir. And thank you, everyone. That was a lot of fun.
Jody, welcome to the stage.
No pressure, guys. My slides are just a bit simpler.
All our stuff.
Okay, I got the clicker in hand here. I think I have a plan. It's really my pleasure to give you a first look at our quarterly Sioux Falls CEO survey. I know many of you participate in that. We thank you for that. We do this in partnership with the Augustana Research Institute, and we work now closely with the Minneapolis Bank of the Federal Reserve. So we share those results with them. They use that to inform some of their own analysis and communication internally. And then we also loop in our friends at the Sioux Falls Development Foundation, get their comments on it, and they use that to gain insight into what the business community is experiencing and expecting as well. So we just conducted this quarterly survey in mid-September, mid to late September. So these are really fresh results. We've not run them yet on SiouxFalls.business. You are the first to get a look at them. We will put that story together here for early next week. But it's a nice look here as we lead into the panel discussion on just the state of things. And I think it will actually dovetail quite well with the conversation that we just had. So again, get my slides in front of me here. So I'm going to start with what our CEOs, and we heard from about 70 of you, are saying about the business climate in Sioux Falls, their take on the state of things in our city. And right away, you will begin to see some softening in their perceptions. So I mean, we are still, certainly comparatively, very good. We had 47% of our CEOs say that they felt the overall business climate in Sioux Falls today was good. 32%, about a third, still said that it was excellent. So you combine those two, and you have nearly 80% of CEOs in this community saying that they think business conditions are good or excellent. 16% said fair, 5% said poor. And if we look back a year ago, we have seen this softening all throughout the course of 2023, but I think it's especially striking, you know, when you and I were having this conversation a year ago, what things looked like. A year ago, nearly half of our CEOs said things were excellent. Today, it's just under a third. 42% went good. So combined on that, we were over 90% good or excellent. Today, we're just under 80. So there's a clear trending as far as a bit of a weakening perception in the overall business climate in Sioux Falls going on there. If we were to go back even further, 2 years ago today, we were at 52% excellent and 38% good. So we were really hanging in there right around the 90% for the last couple of years. And in the last year, we've dropped to just under 80. And then, of course, we always ask our CEOs about the U.S. business climate, and it always trends the same way. And you know, you can argue about reality versus perception, but this is at least the perception of Sioux Falls CEOs, and that again shows some erosion, I think, in their confidence in the U.S. economy. More than half said that they felt the U.S. business climate was fair, 55%. 27% said good. 3% said excellent, 15% said poor. So again, continuing some of the trending that we've seen throughout this year, and certainly if we were to look back last year, 7% actually said the U.S. economy was excellent a year ago. Today it's down to 3%. 10% were calling it poor a year ago. Today it's 15%. And then we ask about overall conditions at your business. And again, this is the perspective of the CEO in these businesses. And I think, you know, by and large, things appear to be still quite favorable, maybe not surprising in Sioux Falls, which seems to weather the national climate better than most places. But nearly 60% of our CEOs said that conditions were good in their business. 16% called them excellent. 20% went at least fair. And 5% said that they were poor. If we were to look back, jump back a year ago though, we were at 88% that said things were good or excellent, and today we're just over 70%. We asked then about business activity, expectations for the coming quarter, so this would take us through the end of 2023. Not a whole lot of movement here throughout the year. Half of our respondents said that they expected average business activity in the next 3 months. 23% actually went above average, which I think if you compare that to the last few years, if they're still saying above average, that says something. 21% said below average. If we were to look back at the prior quarter, we were a little bit better as far as those looking at above average activity. We were at 36% above average versus 23%. Again, we were about half saying average. We were at about 11% saying below average expectations, and today we're at 21%. We ask about hiring, both existing hiring and expectations for hiring. And you know, it really is noticeable to me. We look at unemployment data all the time as well, but our businesses are continuing to at least try and hire. 56% said that in the next 3 months they expected at least average hiring, 13% expected above average, 21% went below average, and 10% were not sure. Not all that different than what we saw earlier in the year, and there's some seasonality to this as well, I think, as people maybe exhaust their budgets getting toward the end of the year. They don't necessarily look at hiring as much. But 3 months ago, again, we were at about half expecting average hiring, 21% at that point were going above average, 18% were still going below. Now, if we look at actual change in hiring in the third quarter, it gets a bit more interesting. Half of our respondents, more than half actually, 53%, said that they had no change in their hiring in the third quarter. 29% experienced a slight increase. 5% saw a significant increase. What we don't ask is how many of them were trying to hire versus actually able to hire. So this is ones that actually saw new hires begin employment. What I did do, we look at this change quarter to quarter. I actually went back and looked a year ago, because if we look here at who saw a slight decrease or a significant decrease in hiring, again, in the last 3 months, it was 9% of our CEOs that said they saw slight or significant decreases in their hiring in the third quarter. A year ago, that was 2%. So we've moved from 2% to 9%, saying that they have slightly or significantly decreased their hiring. And then finally, we ask about capital expenditures, and this is a forward-looking question, capital expenditures for the next 3 months. 47% said that they expected average capital spending, 29% went below average, 15% went above, and 10% were not sure. I also looked up that 29% saying that they had below average expectations for capital spending. That's twice what it was a year ago. So again, sometimes seasonality plays into it, but if we were to look year over year, there's been a definite drop there as well. So we are sharing these results, as I said, with the Minneapolis Fed, with our partners at Augustana certainly, and with the Sioux Falls Development Foundation. We are going to bring you their analysis and insight on those numbers on October 9th. So check siouxfalls.business at that time for that complete report. But there is your first look at how things are trending. And with that, I'd like to invite our panelists up, and while they are coming to the stage, I am actually going to read through their bios for you. You all can choose whatever seat you would like, maybe save me the one on the end, and I will let you know who you're going to be hearing from today. Dan Brendan is the Director of Engineering at Terex Utilities in Watertown. He's been with Terex in Watertown for over 24 years. Serves on multiple boards, including the Lake Area Technical College Foundation, Watertown Municipal Utilities, Sioux Valley Federal Credit Union in Watertown, as well as on several national standards boards related to the electric utility industry. Blaine Chrisman is the founding partner of private equity firm Badlands Capital. He has more than 30 years of experience financing and investing in middle market companies. He founded South Dakota Equity Partners to evaluate equity investments in private South Dakota companies, originating and leading investments in 8 companies in manufacturing, software, biotechnology, and medical device industries. His previous experience includes serving as founder and partner of Prism Mezzanine Fund SBIC, and as principal with Bank of America Capital Investors, a mezzanine debt and equity investing partnership funded by Bank of America. David Lemstra and his family own Dakota Line Dairy, which is located near Humboldt, includes 19 employees and 4,000 cows. He and his family relocated from California in 2020 after more than 40 years in the dairy industry in that state. He's an innovator in the business, and he and his extended family have already made significant investments in South Dakota, becoming advocates for agribusiness in this state. Scott Peterson joined Schwann's Company in December 2008 as Executive Vice President and Chief Human Resource Officer. He now leads the company's human resources function to include overseeing the government affairs function. Prior to Schwann's, he held human resources leadership roles with some of the leading consumer brands companies in the United States, including Pillsbury, Sleep Number, and Quaker Oats. He serves as chair of the board of directors of the Minnesota Wild Foundation, board chair of Real Time Talent, a nonprofit focused on using analytics to improve workforce development in Minnesota. And finally, Brian Sandvig has served as the CFO at Valley Queen Cheese Factory in Millbank, South Dakota since 2007, including 3 years overseeing operations from 2018 to 2021. He joined Valley Queen after a decade as a banker to dairies, farmers, and agribusiness. He serves on multiple boards, including the South Dakota Board of Technical Education, South Dakota Chamber of Commerce and Industry, South Dakota State Historical Society, South Dakota Junior Achievement, Grant County Economic Development Corporation, and the City of Millbank Parks and Rec, and he also manages to coach on the Millbank High School football team. So please help me welcome these panelists. This is going to be a great conversation. I appreciate all of them being here. Let me stick my name on here. Nice to see you. I got through your whole intro, so you've got a football game coming up, I suspect. And
we're switching between offense and defense at practice right now.
Okay, well, real-time updates here. You know, I think we're going to just go down the line, and every year, you know, we try to take a different angle with this panel, and it's always very timely. And this year's is why South Dakota? And you know, it's not just about, I don't think, making us all feel good about being here, right? I'm sure we will after hearing your impressions of the state. But it's about learning what drew you here, you know, how can we replicate that really, and what can we learn from the experience to make it even better and to make the state even more appealing to others. So I'm gonna start for everybody with that question by way of introductions, you know, as far as how did your business come to be here today? What was it about South Dakota that uniquely made it a fit for you? And Brian, I will start with you. I'll work my way down, and then maybe we'll go in reverse order from there.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Valley Queen is a cheese manufacturer, dairy manufacturer up in northeast South Dakota in Millbank. We're 94-year-old, family-owned, and employee-owned company. So our founders, two Swiss immigrants, found South Dakota, chose why South Dakota back in 1928. The answer was why South Dakota. Alfred Ganzenbach was driving from Wisconsin to look at a new cheese factory in Montana. He stopped for gas in Millbank. The community leaders there convinced him to stay and look at a property that they wanted to put him in, and he went out and visited with all the farmers about bringing some cream into the plant to make cheese with. And so the simple answer was, why South Dakota? So he didn't have to keep driving to Montana. And the answer of why we still have grown and done well in northeastern South Dakota today remains the same. You know, 99% of our finished product goes east, goes to the Great Lakes region to be converted and made into packaged dairy products that you all would consume. And so had he kept going, we may not be there still today. So it's a great area for us to grow in.
All right, it's great to be here today, and feel very welcome, and it's good to be back in Sioux Falls. I was telling Jody before we started that for about 6 months I spent every weekend in Sioux Falls because my son played for the Sioux Falls Stampede hockey team a few years back, so it's a great city, and it's good to be back. I'll tell you just a minute about Schwan's and then why South Dakota. First, I need to let you know who we're not. People hear Schwan's, they think yellow delivery trucks. That is no longer part of the company that I'm associated with. When we were purchased 4 years ago by CJ, a company based in Seoul, Korea, the Schwan family kept the home delivery business. So the company I'm affiliated with, still called Schwan's, is a $4 billion in sales food company with over 8,000 employees throughout the US. Our major products are pizza. We make more pizzas than anybody in the world. Red Baron, Freshetta, Tony's. We make pies, Mrs. Smith's and Edwards. And a growing Asian business as well. The Asian business is very important. A Korean-based company is looking to export Korean food throughout the world, and if they want to be number one in the world in food, which is what they desire, they needed to be in the biggest commercial market in the world, which is North America, and that's why they bought Schwan. So building a plant in Sioux Falls, South Dakota is critical to our long-term growth strategy, essential to who we are. And what's even more helpful is Asian food is on trend in the consumers throughout not only the Midwest, but throughout the country. So we're going to build a 700,000 square foot facility in I-90 and I-29. We're still figuring out the timing, but we're excited about the prospect of being here. And the reason we came here was you've got a very supportive business climate, very pro-business. The government, starting from the governor on down, has been very good to work with. Even though there are workforce challenges, we think that we're going to be able to get the talented workforce to work in the state-of-the-art food plant. And again, we're very excited to be coming to South Dakota.
Yeah, good evening, Dave Lemstra. Glad to be here. It's a joy to be in South Dakota. Why South Dakota? Really, it comes down to a few things. The water comes from the sky. We came from an environment where we had to plead with Sacramento for water and plead with Washington, D.C. for water, and regulation run wild is not good for agriculture or business. So that's one of the reasons why we're here. The governor's economic development team did a great job recruiting dairymen at the International Farm Show a few years ago, brought us in. Of course, availability of farm ground, dairy ground, ag processing, dairy processing, and then, yeah, being a good Dutchman, I have to make sure there's a good Christian Reformed church and school also. So that's part of the equation. But it's a joy to be here, and thanks for having us.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so Terex, so a little bit about us. We produce the booms and bodies that go onto the trucks that linemen use to work on energized power lines. We've been doing that since 1945. Actually, back then we were known as Telelect, and in 1945 it was started actually in Bloomington, Minnesota. So we made the move to South Dakota almost 50 years ago now. 1976 is when it moved from Bloomington to one plant in Watertown and one at Huron. So we've been here a long time, and in 2017 we saw an opportunity to consolidate a lot of buildings into one. We had grown into 11 different buildings in Watertown just through normal growth, and obviously that's very, it's not very productive, moving people and materials using forklifts and truck and trailers moving across those buildings. So we wanted one location, and we found it. We had opportunity to do a variety of different things, but at the end of the day, building one location in Watertown, 450,000 square foot facility was the right choice for us. So we opened the doors on that in July 2020. Not the greatest time to open up a $100 million factory, but it's been great, and we're growing exponentially. So we're happy to be in South Dakota for the last 50 years, and we continue to stay here.
Thank you. And Blaine?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. The answer to why South Dakota is both personal and professional for me. The easy rationalization is you're from South Dakota originally, it's easy to move back. To me, it was more important than that. I had moved away in 1992 and spent over 20 years in North Carolina, but primarily Chicago, investing in companies around the country and even internationally. Minority and majority equity in private companies, manufacturing, business services, healthcare. And as I saw trends in private equity and economic growth throughout the United States, I didn't want to be an asset manager. I wanted to be more actively involved in companies, get to know management teams and employees, understand the business model, provide input, not only just capital, but intellectual capital to help businesses have impact in their communities and also with their employees. So I was looking at ways that I could do that, and thought about South Dakota. It's interesting, Joe Santos' comments about we've been living in a dislocation from historical economic truths since the global financial crisis. I moved back to Sioux Falls and started Badlands Capital in 2011. I saw cheap money, risk-taking, inflation in asset values, and that trend continued with low interest rates throughout the last 15 years. And so I moved back because this community, this state, is the way private equity used to be done. Hands-on involvement in founder-owned, family-owned businesses with an eye toward the rising tide lifting all boats, all stakeholders, including employees, and having impact on communities. So to me, South Dakota, even today in 2023, is a way what I practice as a craft can still be done with the human interest and not just cost of capital and quick flip. I would also say, why South Dakota? People try to input culture into the businesses they invest. Culture is important. South Dakota already has a great work ethic, personal ethic. People treat each other well. And so there isn't a lot of tweaking we need to do in culture in a lot of the businesses we invest in. And finally, capital markets risk is important to us. I think it's an overwhelming value to the state of South Dakota to have prudent, long-standing community lenders that don't take risk with debt capital structures and force liquidity issues onto companies and over-leveraged businesses. That's not our MO, and this, again, is a state where we can practice business that way.
Blaine, I was thinking back to when I first met you, and there weren't many people in South Dakota doing what you do. There still aren't, I don't think, maybe a few more. And I remember thinking, how is this going to go for him? Looking for companies to invest in that were the right fit for you. So how has it gone, first of all, and what does it look like today as far as the need here for your services?
Yeah, we should have gotten together more often. The answer is lonely. There aren't a lot of people doing what we do at Badlands Capital. What we do is take commitments from institutional investors, banks, corporations, family offices, foundations, and invest those in companies, either in minority or majority controlled positions. Most of what we've done is in the state of South Dakota. Our latest fund, Badlands Capital, is investing in South Dakota and adjoining states, but selectively in companies that have South Dakota characteristics. It's been slower when we get to the workforce development. I can answer the question on the portfolio company level, but at the Badlands Capital level, this is still artisan investing, developing skills. There aren't a lot of people doing it, so there weren't a lot of people to hire. Institutional investors want to back teams, not individuals. So scaling has been slower, but it's given us more time to spend with the portfolio companies, and I would say we're gaining momentum over the last couple of years. The stable and growing economy has certainly helped us.
Great. Dan, I want to talk a little further on the plant expansion. You know, often I hear from fast-growing businesses that it's sometimes not enough. They'll just get done with one expansion. They'll already be looking to the future. So what does business activity look like for you today? How has that expansion treated you? And what might the future look like at Terex?
Yeah, we certainly didn't build the building big enough. We thought it was maybe too big, but we should have went bigger. So there's tremendous demand for our products, especially now. The U.S. electric grid is, it depends on what you read and who you ask. It was all produced in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. 70% roughly of it is over 25 years old. So it's an aged grid, and it takes our trucks to work on that grid to either maintain it or expand it. And there's a big interest in expanding now with electric vehicles and renewables and things like that. So it's, you know, that's putting tremendous stress on an aged infrastructure. So none of us in this room would want our power shut off at any point of the day. We demand 24/7 power, and it's our machines that allow line workers to work on those lines while they're live. So a tremendous demand for our product. A lot of headwinds for us on how do we produce trucks faster for our customers. It's a long list. I won't get into all of them, but you know, clearly the biggest is workforce, and we're working on a variety of things in that area. Attracting locally, attracting from out of state, working with the various programs that the state's putting on, but a lot of headwinds with that too, because affordable housing is a major issue for us in Watertown. I think it's a major issue across the state. So we get a lot of people interested in coming to South Dakota and working for us, but unfortunately they just can't find the housing. Affordable, the key word is affordable housing that they can move into. So we're doing a lot of other things. We're making continued investments to expand our facility and invest capital in automation. which is nothing new. You might be wondering, why haven't you been doing automation for decades? We make a very custom product. There really isn't anything that we do hundreds or thousands of every week that's the same that you could put on an automated line. It's a very customized product, but there's still opportunity for automation. So we're investing in those areas with our suppliers, or some of our suppliers do automation, and we're working with them. Lake Erie Technical College in Watertown has a terrific robotics program, and we're working closely with them and their graduates to expand what we can do. So it's really a multifaceted approach. So as we grow, it's not just good for us and our direct team members. It's good for the region. 95% of everything that we buy, steel and fiberglass, plastic, all sorts of things, come within a 500-mile radius of Watertown. So that's North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska. So not only is our company important to Watertown and Huron, it's important to this whole region, and we're very proud of that.
And we will do a deeper dive on workforce in this conversation as well, for those who are wondering. David, thanks so much for being here. It's nice to meet you in person. I did a piece on the dairy industry, which I think is fascinating. The dairy industry in this state, at least from my perspective, is sort of this quiet powerhouse. You don't find a lot of dairy owner-operators real eager to talk to reporters like me. So it was wonderful to be able to get David's perspective. I appreciate you being part of this conversation as well. The time I spoke to you, you hadn't been in town all that long, and we talked about what drew you here, and you did in your introduction as well, but I'm curious to hear how it's gone, any surprises about being in South Dakota, any challenges that maybe you didn't expect.
Yeah, surprises, challenges, yeah, loads of them, bucketfuls. A whole lot to learn with a new facility, new workforce, a new region. I'm still waiting to develop weather amnesia, because I always hear it's never that cold, it's never that windy. So I'm still waiting for that to develop. But for us, it's been a joy for me and my family to be here. Yeah, to reflect on, we've only been here 3 years. We contracted everything and started the process pre-COVID, pre-pandemic. So we were able to get things built very reasonable, under budget, and on time. That hardly ever happens. So we're excited about that. Yeah, being in the state that is very, very open to agriculture, very, very open to production. I permitted a dairy in California. It took me 7 years and $1 million just to get a permit. Wow. This one here took 10 weeks and $10,000, so that sounds pretty open to me. It's been a challenge. Some of the challenges, weather, yeah, new regulations, meaning they're reasonable. It's almost mind-boggling.
And we should say you had other family come too. I mean, I don't know if I forget if you all came at the same time, but there's extended family that came as well. And
yeah, generally Dutchmen like to travel in packs, so. Yeah, the Dairy by Baltic is family, and they relocated at the same time. Experienced the same frustrations and headwinds in California, so that's why they moved this way also. Yeah, we feed a lot of corn silage, a lot of corn products, soybean meal, gluten feeds. Everything comes by truckload. We don't have to have anything hit a rail. Nothing has to come by ship. Cottonseed doesn't have to come from Australia. Everything's local. So that's a big, big production benefit for us. So I think that's kind of a good start.
Absolutely. Scott, I checked with Scott prior to the conversation just to say, well, can we talk about the CJ project? Because I know many of you, me included, have been looking forward to an update on that facility. A lot of excitement when it was announced, and sometimes as the months go by, you wonder, all right, is this going to happen? And he tells me that it will. I think it might be helpful, though, Scott, if you shared a little more about the project itself and why it is taking so long for you to hone in on exactly the design that you want to go with here.
Yeah, I think it's a great question and a very fair question. I'd say two factors. One, and as you saw earlier today, we're living in very turbulent economic times, and the ability to forecast I'll start with the consumer demand side, is even more challenging. And when you're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a state-of-the-art, world-class facility, you want to make sure that when you hit that switch and you're running those lines and you're at full capacity of, let's say, 600 employees, you're going to fill the plant up. So at this point, trying to forecast that demand has been a bit elusive, and we want to have a better level of confidence, not if, but when we can break ground and build the facility. So that's one piece. Again, the good news is, as I said, that the trend in food consumption in Asian is really fast. In fact, when you look at one of the CJ brands that we have called Bibigo, it's the fastest selling frozen Asian food brand in the upper Midwest, including South Dakota. So we're onto something that's very popular, that's on trend. But again, we have facilities right now, Asian facilities on the West Coast and the East Coast, and this plant will serve not only the center of the US, but we think because of the central location, which was another criteria, we'll be able to serve the country. So that's on the demand side. The other is, as you all know, post-pandemic, the supply chain, whether it's parts, other things you need to manufacture, especially when you source it globally, has been a challenge. So I think making sure that we have what we need to do the design we need is important. And finally, we did just finish the state-of-the-art renovation in Kansas with world-class pizza production facilities. So we're still learning as we get that plant up to speed, and it's not up at full speed yet, how to best take advantage of that technology. So those are, I'd say, three of the major variables that we're balancing that are really going to determine the timing of when we build the plant. But it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, and we're doing serious planning right now.
Fantastic, thank you. We'll visit more on the workforce topic with you as well. And then finally, Brian, let's talk expansion. Again, I mean, it's a bit of a theme here, you know, which is interesting, despite the uncertain economic times that so many of you on this stage are still looking ahead. You're in expansion mode as well. Just give us an update on that. And maybe that dovetails well, too, with the why South Dakota question. I'm sure you could have looked elsewhere. You chose to stay where you are.
Absolutely. You know, we're a conversion plant. Milk comes in one end, cheese, milk fat, sugar, protein go out the other end of the plant. We convert in the middle. So the simple question for us, as far as where would we expand next, would be, is it closer to our customers who are taking our finished products, or is it closer to our dairies who are providing us with the raw material? And, you know, why South Dakota? Agriculture is still number one here. Beautiful bean harvest going on the drive down to the event here today. Everything, I'm glad that it worked this way, so David got to talk before I did, but the dairies that have chosen to move their operations or expand their operations here in the I-29 corridor in the last 10, 15 years is really driving and pushing us to expand. And, you know, what we do at our facility is we really focus in on quality and a variety of products. And so if we can continue to make a product that our customers want more of, then we can buy more milk and help the industry grow. Just a couple of numbers that I think maybe illustrate some of the changes. Again, 94-year-old family-owned company, but a lot's changed in the last 10, 15 years. So currently we're bringing 5 million pounds of milk every day in from about 80,000 cows, and that's from around 95 miles around our plant. That's from 40 dairies. Today, 95% of our milk comes from dairies that are less than 15 years old. Wow. So these dairies today on average have between 2,500 and 3,000 cows on the dairy. It's become an efficient way to convert South Dakota's natural resources from the egg sector into a value-added product that you all can find at your local C-store, grocery store, online, and whatever. So when in doubt, eat cheese.
Well, and it's a balance, right? I mean, this is, as I learned about the dairy industry, right? We need the dairies, but the dairies need the end markets. They need people like you to buy the product. Yeah. You also need the dairies to supply. Where are we at in that balance right now?
It's I have yet to find, if anybody can help me out with this, find me afterwards. I would love to have something better than, it's the chicken or the egg thing, because we're always trying to
I deliberately
explain it for
didn't use
dairies.
it, but right.
But it is
right.
it's the dairy or the dairy processor, right? When the milk leaves the farm every day, it's perishable. It can't, unlike beans or corn, it can't sit in a pile for 3-4 months over winter until we get to it and what have you. And so it is, it's a constant push and pull where there's more milk in the region, so it draws processors, or there's more processing capacity. The short answer is we're full. And so it's on folks like us. AgriPure has done so as well, and there's some other operations over in Minnesota it's incumbent on us to keep up and continue to be able to process more raw material.
Okay. I will go to workforce now because I think it's just such a universal topic. So maybe I'll stick with you because I think that probably goes right alongside with trying to manage the cost of construction and financing and supply chain and all of that is finding people to work in these plants, right? Where are you finding people? How are you finding people?
So 2 years ago when we looked at this expansion, there's a $200 million price tag for it. We have to know whether or not there's enough cows, another 30,000 cows that we can get milk from. We have to know if our customers are going to be willing to take our product. And thankfully, in rather short order, we covered all that. The biggest question our owners, our board, our employees, our community had is, well, where were we going to find 140 people? We have 300 people today, and we need 140 more when we get going. In Millbank, South Dakota population, 3,500. So it's a real challenge. Thankfully, we've been, I think, working for generations to be considered a premier employer in the area, treat the employees right. 10 years ago, we got aggressive in recruiting from Mexico using a visa program where we would recruit in Mexico and bring some folks up into the plant, and that was a slow build up, and that worked well. And frankly, the COVID, I don't know what the whole formal term is, but the influx of folks to South Dakota over the last few years, we've benefited from up in our neck of the woods. Lastly, we're doing okay in our neck of the woods because of those, and there's a processor down the road about 10 miles that's expanding their facility in Wisconsin, getting closer to that finished product. And those employees, many of whom have raised their hand and asked to come work for us as part of our expansion. So we've been fortunate enough to cover that for our needs.
Okay. I don't know if you caught this, hopefully you did in Scott's bio, I'll repeat it if not. Scott has an extensive career in HR, has worked for a lot of brands that you know well, but he also is the board chair of something called Real-Time Talent, which focuses on using analytics to improve workforce development in Minnesota. So I am not going to claim that we in South Dakota have all the answers around workforce development. I would love to know what we can learn about using real-time analytics that you've done in Minnesota. So can we start with some of your own workforce best practices and takeaways from that role, and then we'll chat about the expansion as well.
I wish I could say there was some secret algorithm. There isn't. Really, you've got to look at your fundamental supply. So when you look at South Dakota, even though there has been a net influx, the rate of growth in South Dakota around employment, in terms of employees needed, is really outpacing the population growth. So it's a matter of keeping the people you have in the state to work, and then attracting, whether it's from other states or frankly from other countries, to come to South Dakota to meet the needs. So there's a fundamental supply opportunity that I think the state, and I clearly see with the governor starting at the top, is marketing herself and her state to attract people to come to South Dakota, which I think is very good and very healthy and a very good practice. But I think, assuming you get the numbers, then it's a matter of do they have the skills to meet the needs. Everyone up here, even though we're in different industries, innovation, technology, it's going to take a different set of skills for the next 5 or 10 years than it did for the last 5 or 10 years. So the collaboration with, whether it's university level, whether it's technical schools, like we've spoken with between Schwan's and South Dakota, and even going into the high schools and middle schools to market the kinds of great careers that people can have in manufacturing and agriculture and other industries, good pay, good benefits, good culture, that may attract people into that sector that they wouldn't ordinarily have considered. And that, even though many of us may compete for the same talent, And that's fine, but if all we do is compete for the same talent and the pie doesn't get bigger, all we're going to end up doing is jacking up wages and putting pressure on our margins and putting pressure on our ability to compete with other companies in other markets. So we've got to find a way to collaborate to make the pool of talent bigger than it is to meet our needs. And that takes paradigm shift. It takes revisiting what we normally think our role is. We need to look at the supply chain of talent, much like we do the supply chain of materials, and partner with the vendors of talent who are educational institutions to try and make sure that we can increase the number of people, young people that are interested in our kind of work. And they don't even necessarily all have to have 4-year degrees. In fact, in many cases, a 2-year degree, a 1-year certificate, just to get in the door can be enough. And then if employers are good and match education with tuition reimbursement and other ways to develop themselves, they can continue to advance in the company. So I think it's that kind of philosophy, that kind of paradigm shift in how employers collaborate, working in close concert with the state and educational institutions, I think is one way to help crack the code.
Now, I mean, you could start construction today and you would still be years away from opening this plant. So, I mean, it's safe to say you have some time, but I'm curious, what is your hiring strategy already looking like in Sioux Falls? You need to hire 600-700 people. Where will you start? How will you start?
Well, we've already started. We had, and this was right early COVID days, but we had a summit. The CEO and myself was involved with meeting that from key leaders at SDSU, USD, and some of the technical colleges to begin mapping out our strategy. And what I love about the meeting is that the institutions educationally, they weren't competing with each other and try and corner the market on what Schwann's would do. They said, this will be my lane. I'll focus on maybe some of the maintenance roles. Another one will focus on the management roles. So there's a recognition that people need to be in their lane. Everyone's going to get a piece of the business, a piece of the work, a piece of the partnership with Schwann's. And we've just got to be clear about what specific skills are going to be needed. And the old adage, if you build it, they will come. If you train the students in those skills, we will be there. We will guarantee a certain number of hires, which can give you a level of confidence. You can invest in the kind of curriculum and courses that you're going to have to teach and train so that we're going to show up. And the good thing about that is there'll be other employers who will also benefit from that kind of work.
Thank you. David, I remember when we spoke, this is a growing industry that you and others like you are trying to develop here in the state. There's not an automatic pool of talent to support that. So how have you gone about meeting your own workforce needs, and particularly as you look at growth, what's your strategy?
Yeah, I look at this issue from a bit of a different lens. Where I came from, California, there was such a emphasis on social help, grocery assistance, rental assistance, gas assistance, that there was really a pool of unemployable people. So when I come to South Dakota, even on my entry-level people that are less skilled, I'm very pleased because there's lots of them. And it's really a breath of fresh air. I'm probably the only guy in the room saying, this is fabulous. I understand your challenges, but I think it could get much worse. And, that's one of the reasons I would say, we all can look around the room and say, we've got something very special here in South Dakota if we choose to keep it. So, what do? Yeah, I do use the visa program, and we do recruit through some ag agencies, and we do have talent that comes. I'm close enough to Sioux Falls, so I get a lot of people out of Sioux Falls that work for me. I don't have to provide housing like some other farms do. For me, I would say that it's been a joy to recruit and employ another labor force here. Mainly Guatemalans and Hondurans. California, we use Mexican culture. There's a variation there that I've had to learn, but yeah, it's been a joy. So I may be the odd man out on this one.
It's all about perspective, right? That's good to hear. And then you mentioned your expansion, needing to maybe even do more. How much of that is going to be driven by your ability to attract that talent? And then maybe how is automation playing into this? Not necessarily supplanting jobs, but maybe changing the skill set that you need.
Yeah, it's hard to estimate. I mean, this is a big issue for sure, and it's going to take more than one solution. So we're placing our chips in a lot of different areas, automation being a big one. But also another big one is we're looking, harder. We're advertising ourselves more to maybe the non-traditional folks that wouldn't normally look at a manufacturing job. I remember when I started 25 years ago, the majority of the team members we had maybe grew up on a farm or they had some mechanical background, and so they were looking for a welding or a machining or that kind of manufacturing job. Today, I mean, it's been interesting to see just the last few years. We've attracted, there's one in particular, a nurse that we attracted that was looking for something different, which never would have expected that. Looking at high school students that maybe are not quite sure what they want to do and maybe had never thought about, a manufacturing job. And today's manufacturing job is so much different than it was before.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of think in your mind it's this smoky, loud factory and there's welding and grinding, and it's very much not the fact today. It's very well lit, everything's pre-painted, and you're putting things together, and it's not massive things you're putting together. Sometimes it's quite small things. So lots and lots of variety. And so really just advertising ourselves and hosting tours for high school students and technical school students and really anyone from the community that wants to walk through. And it certainly helps to have a brand new factory that has a lot of technology and a lot of cool things to show off. So yeah, I'd say that's primarily where we're focusing our time.
Okay. And Blaine, you spoke earlier about the challenges of finding people in your specific industry, but I'm curious also, as you're working with companies trying to scale up, sometimes that can be a special challenge for a newer company to try and find and be competitive with talent.
Yeah, I would answer the question in 3 different ways. One, just Badlands Capital, I've touched on that a bit, but we're working with the university systems. Augustana University, we have 2 interns starting this week to help us and provide lift and train them as the next generation in private equity. We have used interns from USD, South Dakota State. We have 2 out-of-state intern applicants, Kansas University and Creighton. So we're trying to reverse the brain drain at the Badlands Capital level. We have 2 areas of focus. One is more technology, software. The other is manufacturing. From the technology portfolio company standpoint, I think our portfolio companies are offering salaried jobs in high growth industries with interesting companies. And if they want to get into software and remain in South Dakota, there are very few options. We have a great success story in Rapid City Property Meld, where the headquarters of that company are in Rapid City, 2 School of Mines graduates who want to impact Rapid City long-term with that software company. And so we find a couple of opportunities like that where it's an appealing job for engineering, technology, software types of graduates. On the manufacturing side, one of the considerations from workforce and from a Badlands Capital standpoint is it's not growing under existing ownership. It's a 70-year-old founder to whom do I sell my business and keep my legacy in place. And so workforce is a key element of that. We are looking to grow businesses in South Dakota and not strip them, move them, look to cut expenses and flip it to a new owner. And so workforce is a key element of the Badlands thesis and brand. And so when we talk with existing owners and founders of manufacturing companies, these are typically 15 to 40 people in manufacturing. We're downstream from Terex, so we are cutting, bending, welding, painting, but improving lighting and air handling and 4 10-hour work weeks for time flexibility is an important element. Raising to a livable wage. We're not blowing up wage rates in communities, but we are bringing up to a livable wage. Terex and other large employers certainly have gold-plated health care and retirement plans. A lot of the smaller manufacturers don't. We're taking that on our shoulders as new owners because a key element of workforce is not just new hires to grow, it's reducing churn at the employee level. So we want to get some of these small manufacturers up to employers of choice in the communities where we invest. And we're not going to compete with Terex or Schwann's or others, because we're competing more with, will I have a job and can I support my family, which, an aside, is frankly tragic that people still have to make that choice in today's economy.
Well, as you all know, I could ask questions all day, but I want to make sure we get to yours. And my goal is that if you so choose, you are using your drink ticket maybe slightly before 6 p.m. So anyone with a question, I would ask that you come up to the mic because it is being recorded. So we want to make sure that we pick up your questions. But fire away. Otherwise, I'm going to keep going. You've been warned. Seriously, you all had questions for Santos and you don't have any for them? All right, I'm going to do one then. I'm going to do a quick combo question. I will leave a little bit of time. If you have a question, think about it, because I'll do one more call. I'm just going to go down the line here. Brian, I'll start with you. Anything we need to know, again, the angle here is why South Dakota. So anything that we should know to make our state even more optimized as a place to do business as you consider your own options. And then just a quick look at what you think the year ahead holds for your organization.
In our neck of the woods, one of the things we ran into as part of our expansion, again, abundant agriculture resources, thankfully, capital, workforce, large. One of the things we ran into was just utilities. In order to be able to convert these raw materials into value-added egg products, and I'm assuming this is other places across rural South Dakota, electric and natural gas
Capacity
and water.
challenges?
Capacity challenges, yeah. And just, you know, it's a long process in order to get what you need where. So I think that's something that as soybean processing and other, you know, meat packing and other value-added egg operations and opportunities, that there may be, you may be checking 9 out of the 10 boxes across the state for having the resources aligned, but that is one area that, you know, from a looking forward standpoint, I would call out. What was the second part?
They're big investments too. Coming year, what do you see? Opportunities, challenges?
People are going to keep eating cheese and cows are going to keep making milk.
That's a tough one to follow.
Right, Scott, you're kind of in the thick of it. So, you know, again, anything thus far that we could be doing differently to make your life even easier?
Well, I would
here?
just say to reemphasize a couple points that have been made. The key enabler for workforce is housing. If people can't find affordable housing, they're not going to come to the state. And that's not unique to South Dakota, Minnesota, a lot of other states. And it is a solvable problem. You get smart people, you look at your public policy, you look at your private sector, and I don't think it's something that can't be solved, but it needs to be solved, and it needs to be solved pretty quickly. I think the other is affordable childcare. I mean, if you have parents at home, whether it's the mom or the dad, and they can't get their child in childcare, they can't work. So there's employees that could be in our workforce that will only be there if they can find affordable childcare, and that's another opportunity for public-private collaboration to ensure that this happens. In terms of looking at the future, I mean, I think that if you make a high-quality product, let's say pizzas or pies or dumplings at a price that people can afford, you're going to sell it. But I think with the economic uncertainty and the impact on commodity prices, we're all trying to predict, which is a key input into our product, and it affects your pricing strategy. I still think we're going to be white-knuckling it a bit to see what do we do with pricing to make sure that we keep our consumers.
So we'll see you at the groundbreaking someday.
Yes, you will.
David, how about you? Anything that you think the state maybe could be doing differently, and what do you think the coming year holds?
You know, we've been welcomed here by the state, by the county, local people, neighbors, city as well. It's been a joy to be here. You're asking me what I think about next year? Well, I make my living with the backside of a cow, so I may be the wrong guy to be asking. But I'll give you the standard farmer answer. There's always next year, and it's going to be better.
Vikings answer, too. Really the same, I would say. Affordable housing and daycare are major issues. And there's lots of options, and there's openness to solve it from state and city government and even private entities. So I think it'll be solved. I can't tell you today how that's going to happen, but I think it will be solved. And I think that South Dakota sort of drive will get us all together, and we'll get that figured out. For the coming year, we're just going to build trucks. So you're going to see lots of utility trucks coming down the interstate getting delivered to our great electric companies to keep your power on. So we're going to do whatever we can to make that happen.
Blaine, I'm going to preface your introduction with just a note here, and I can't believe it. There must be something in the air, maybe in the market. You guys wouldn't believe how many acquisition stories I have in the works right now. Some of them we've reported, some of them we still need to report it, but this is like acquisition city lately. We need more startups, we need people to be scaling up, we need to be creating those next locally owned and operated businesses. So, I mean, I'm very curious for your perspective as far as what that environment looks like, and if there's anything South Dakota can be doing to further encourage that homegrown growth.
Yeah, from a technology standpoint, we're highly selective on early stage companies. There are a lot of startup activity that really is priming the pump and can develop the next generation of technology and innovation. Again, I think one of the reasons why South Dakota university systems, both public and private, in South Dakota have been great partners to us, and I think will be contributing to that innovation growth. So continue to support the university systems in the state. I think that will be a key driver of innovation. We can't be the only fund investing in South Dakota. That's not a, why isn't there anyone else? It's, there needs to be other people. We would accept competition from other providers of private capital because we have to do portfolio construction. We're a small team, we're hands-on. There needs to be more capital available in the state, whether it's public or private, to drive some of this innovation. I would have to say North Dakota is doing a much better job than South Dakota. This is why South Dakota, but there needs to be public-private sources of capital at the early stage to seed some of that innovation. What can people do to be helpful to us? We are not outbid people in an efficient investment banking process. We source through relationships. We talk to bankers, attorneys, accountants, commercial insurers who have clients considering selling their businesses. So if you know anyone in your community considering selling or reducing their primary asset in their business and bringing on a value-add investor, we'd certainly love to talk. We're not sharp-elbowed. We're from South Dakota, so we treat referrals as you would hope. And from the just what is the future bringing, I think we are going to continue to grow innovation. The workforce and innovation answer also to me is Governor Dugard asked me to raise South Dakota Equity Partners in 2016. Part of the emphasis of that fund was diversify the economy into technology and to increase salaried technology jobs in South Dakota. Even prior to the pandemic changing the world, it was, these companies were finding talent in coding, software engineering, software sales around the country and around the world, and executive level talent wasn't willing to relocate to South Dakota, so it was a commuting at the executive level. The pandemic magnified that. So some of the workforce development and future prediction is we need to build sustainable and grow innovation in South Dakota, but unfortunately we're going to have to rely on talent from outside the state to supplement it. And just one other quick forecast of the future. We're thesis driven. We absolutely believe in the need to invest in infrastructure, and we are investing in manufacturers in South Dakota. We're talking with 3 that are along those same lines. Component manufacturers who are providing products to infrastructure investment and reinvestment, and supply chains need to shorten, reduce tariffs, delivery times need to shorten. I think all of that with I-29, I-90, our location, all the great OEM manufacturers in the region, manufacturing in South Dakota is going to explode.
Last call for questions. Anybody got one? Otherwise, we will wrap it up.
I don't see anyone walking to the forefront. All right, so with that, I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank our panelists. Take your program with you. You will see at the bottom there's the date for this event next year, right at the beginning of October. There's also the date in February for Business Day at the South Dakota Legislature, so make sure that you mark that one down as well. Please help me thank the panelists once again and the South Dakota Chamber for organizing today's program.